Music 292, Week 7, Part 3, Focal Pitch. In our last video for this week, we're going to talk about a new concept called focal pitch. Let's get started. So in tonal music, we talk about pieces having a tonic note, which is the foundational note of the scale, and what we call a focus for the piece. This note repeats a lot, and notes often resolve to it. However, non-tonal pieces, for example songs in a mode or atonal music, can also have a central emphasized note. The general term we're going to use for this is focal pitch. And part of the reason I'm using this special language for this is I'm trying to teach this to you in a broad way that you can use in your tonal music courses, but also your atonal music courses. Focal pitch is a repeated emphasis or accent on a single note or pitch class. Pitch class is just a general term for a note without a particular octave associated with it. So when I say G, that's an example of a pitch class. When I say the G above middle C, that's an example of a pitch. And so to figure out this repeated emphasis or accent, well, this is exactly where we're going to use the accent types that we learned earlier in this unit. Focal pitches will establish our sense of key, tonality, or tonic. So because they're our central note, they're the thing that other things gravitate to. And that's going to help us to fix what the stable note of the key is, what the tonic of the key is. The focal pitch of a segment, though, need not be the same as the focal pitch of an entire piece. So we can have notes that are emphasized within a phrase, for example, that are not necessarily the overall emphasis for the entire piece. However, when we are talking about that focal pitch for the entire piece, that's what we're going to refer to as tonic. Focal pitch may change from one segment to the next, and those segments can occur in different sizes. We can talk about segments as just being a small motive. We can talk about multiple segments combining to form phrases. We can talk about phrases combining to form sections. Any of these individual levels can have their own focal pitch. Focal pitch is generally based on melodically stable pitches, so they're not going to be things like passing tones or neighbor tones. They're not forms of elaboration. For this video, we're going to focus on a slightly different time period than what we typically do in this course. We'll look back at the medieval era through a couple of examples of plain chant by composer Hildegard von Bingen. Part of the reason I want to use this material is that it's unmetered. The meter is based on the rhythm of the spoken text, rather than being a notated meter in the way that we're used to thinking about it as modern-day classical musicians. This will give us the opportunity to focus more specifically on pitch in this lesson. I want to start by taking a look for accent in this piece. Now we can map these things out manually before we listen to it, and so let's maybe talk about that now. Because this thing doesn't have rhythm, we're going to exclude some of our rhythm types. We don't have duration, for example, and we don't have dynamics in this particular piece. So we're going to essentially scratch those off our list. But we can look at the others. We can look at registral, in other words, the highs and lows. We could look at where leaps happen. We can look for obvious beginning points. We can look for repetition, although that's going to manifest a little bit differently in this repertoire. And we can look at articulation. That's going to mainly, in this case, be articulation via text or punctuation that we're seeing in the written out text. Other things that will be useful for us to look for in this example are note frequency or repetition. This particular time period of repertoire didn't really focus on motivic repetition in the same way that modern music does. So instead of looking for patterns that get repeated, we're going to look for frequency of note that gets repeated. We might want to look at other demarcations in the music as well. So for example, those things that look like tiny little bar lines, I'm going to call those things half bar lines, but those are indicating natural breaks in the text or in the music. Punctuation like commas, for example, and periods will also indicate those natural breaks in the music. And so those are going to be essentially points of obvious beginning afterwards. So take a minute to try to sketch out where you're noticing some of these things. Here's what it sounds like. There's no existing recording of this music as far as I can find, so I'm going to apologize now. You're going to have to listen to me singing the examples in this lesson.
Ego minitas Regina virtutum Dico vanite ad me virtutes et nutriam vos ad requirandam peritam dragmam et ad coronandum and perseverantia feligem.
So you probably noticed a few things in listening to this recording. One was that I was pretty free with the rhythm, and that's general for performance practice for this music. The rhythm is going to be determined by the lengths of the text syllables. But you will also notice there was particular emphasis that was happening. So in terms of note frequency or repetition, you probably noticed that the note D repeats a heck of a lot in this example. It's the most common note in the entire example, but it also tends to start and end sections of this thing as well. So if we take a look, for example, starting at the very beginning of the excerpt, and then stopping at the half bar line, you can see that the A begins with the note D, and the end of das also ends on D. And that right there is telling us that this note has a weight to it. You'll also notice that that D repeated twice in a row as we switch between words in the middle of this phrase. We didn't have any leaps in this section because this is all stepwise motion. We did have an obvious beginning though, since this is the start of the piece. And then lastly, in terms of articulation, well, we have articulation between words that helps give a little bit of emphasis here. So as we switch from ego to humilitas, that's shift from the go to the u, the ending of the first word, to the beginning of the second. That's going to get a little bit of a glottal rearticulation. And because of that, we're going to hear that with a little bit of accentuation, which emphasizes that note D again. So follow through that process for the second phrase here. Think about what notes get repeated the most, which notes get accentuation in some kind of way. So once again, in Regina Virtutum, you probably noticed it started and ended on D, and there was a D in the middle of the phrase. You probably also noticed in this example that we have a low note and a high note. The low note is halfway through a word, but the high note, the F, starts at the beginning of a new word. So that's maybe indicating a little more emphasis here. We don't have a lot in terms of leaps, but we do have a few third leaps. Once again, virtutum, the F of the vir is one of those leap moments. And articulation, once again, we have the division between words that we can see creating emphasis. So once again, D appears to be our focal pitch here. We're going to notice the same thing in the next line of music, that there's a ton of repetition on D, like we can see at the beginning of the second line, and that there's this idea of ending on D essentially as a cadence point. This is a melodic cadence, which I think I talked about in a previous video. It's that idea of stepwise motion to that arrival note. The third line of music, I think, is a little more interesting though, because here's where we finally get a shift. So what note gets repeated the most? Well, it looks like D happens at the beginning, but then you notice as you shift into the second portion of the phrase that that shift actually changes to A. Ad requirendam. There's a whole lot of A in that section. Pel starts on A as well. Artitam dogmam. And then we're ending on that A once again, one more time. So there's been a shift of focal pitch here. This phrase has a focal pitch of A. Going through the rest of the music, we can see that the next section starts on the A, but then transitions back to our D. And then our very last phrase, again, we've got more emphasis on the D with repetition, with that note happening multiple times in the phrase, that note happening at rearticulations, and that being our final cadential note. So I would say overall, the focal pitch for this entire piece is D, but we do get one phrase in the middle where we have a shift to A. Notice that D is scale degree 1, A is scale degree 5. This emphasis on tonic and dominant happens in the earlier repertoire in addition. Although I do have to say medieval chants is kind of its own thing. You'll learn about that in some of your music history courses, probably in second year, but it's not always scale degrees 1 and 5 that get emphasized in that repertoire. All right, I'd like you to try the exact same thing on a second example. Here's me singing it for you.
Ide odi lactissime filii tene ovos in regali talamo.
What note is most repeated? What other kinds of accent are created? Take a minute to work that out. All right, so you probably noticed that E is the note that's the most repeated in this case. It happens at the beginning of our phrase, it happens at the ending of our entire piece, as well as the ending of the first line of music. And you also probably noticed there were other kinds of accentuation happening in this music. So in the first line, we actually don't have a super strong focus on E, but we do get a focus on D essentially as a recitation tone in the middle of this thing. You can actually have more than one focal pitch in a phrase or in an example. I would say, though, there's usually one that's more prevalent for the entire piece. In the second half, I think we maybe get a little bit of a stronger emphasis on E. Our phrase starts with an E on the te. It goes up a step and then comes back down to that. We do get a little bit of a weight on that D there, emphasizing the focus we had on it previously. But we do get a return to E with a lot of neighbor motion surrounding it at the very ending. So this isn't an exact science. And as a result of that, you'll probably have some extended conversation within your discussion groups about how different options might be possible for focal pitch. That is totally okay. What I'm looking for coming out of that is essentially the rationale behind your choices. What are the reasons that you think one answer might be better than another answer? Some of the same techniques can be used to look at other repertoires as well. So in our live class, we're actually going to do a much stronger focus on analysis this week. And we're going to focus specifically on looking at Haydn's Piano Sonata in D major. We're going to take a look at a few different things, but basically we're going to combine what we learned in the 3 different videos. We're going to talk about meter, we're going to talk about beginnings and endings, we're going to talk about focal pitch at any given moment, and we're going to try to figure out what that tells us about things like modulation, things like harmony, and things like form divisions within this piece. Because a lot of this information is going to feed in to tell us how we should divide up our phrases. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next in the live class.